Okay, I think the number's looking all right to get started. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly go over the agenda for the evening. So hello and welcome to DevOps Manchester 22. It's really great to have you all here. Just a quick note before we start, this session is being recorded and it will be shared. So just to let you know that that's the case, and if you're not okay with it, then more than welcome to drop off and catch up with the crowd afterwards. We've got two speakers this evening. Super happy to welcome both Lauren Rodgers and Sophie Weston. So the order will be Lauren first, currently working over at Capital One as a data scientist, with a titled talk of Stop Snoozing Those Alarms. Although should have shouted that, there's an exclamation mark. And Sophie, who's a senior engineer at Anaplan, titled talk of Designing Teams. So really happy to see you both here, and I won't jabber on much more. Just a few notes. If you've got any questions, post them in the chat, and James will be doing a Q&A after each talk. So just list them all up there, and we'll go through them afterwards. I'll mute myself and hide my camera so it's solely on the speaker, as it ought to be. And other than that, we shall get going. So up first is Lauren. So I shall hand over to you and mute my video and stop talking. If that's all right.
Yeah, no problem. Just going to do the awkward thing of getting the presentation slides up. And just want to make sure that my slides are visible to everyone.
Yeah, I've got those.
Nice. Yeah, so as Lee said, stop snoozing those alarms. This is going to be a talk primarily around ChatOps in general, but there is going to be a demo which I'm going to show how AWS Chatbot integrates with Slack and how that is adhering to the ChatOps model. So just for everyone has to have a who am I slide, so I thought I'd put mine in there. So yeah, you'll probably notice that these slides are themed by Peak, which have very kindly allowed me to keep the theme for these slides. But as Lee said, I have recently just moved over to Capital One, but I'm just very thankful that I've not had to rework the slides. But yeah, just outside of work, a big, massive geek, love my science fiction, love gaming on PS4, superheroes, come and find me. We'll have great discussions around why Harley Quinn's the best DC villain. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. So I guess I wanted to talk about what ChatOps is before I dive into the AWS chatbot. So ChatOps itself has been around for a long time. It's nothing new. It's not a new upcoming theme. So, people have probably already been adopting the ChatOps model without realizing it. However, I just thought I'd give a high overview of what I think ChatOps is. And I have primarily broken it down into these three sections here. So the ChatOps model is about connecting people within your team and the technology that those teams use. And I think what I take as the most important element here is that people are still at the heart of using those technologies, and ChatOps is, all about driving, conversation is driving that development between, projects that might be ongoing in your workplace. In particular, I think it's helping DevOps be a bit more autonomous. And the reason for that is, the ChatOps itself allows the DevOps team to work collaboratively, be more streamlined. If problems arise, using a ChatOps model allows them to alleviate or mitigate any issues that may arise, but also collaborate together for your projects. So then the second part is, at the core of that is obviously a bot. And so in order to share that information across teams, we normally use a collaboration tool such as Slack, Microsoft Teams, Stride before it was discontinued. But there's a whole different tool set of collaboration tools that teams can use. But the bot's main objective is to be the bridge between those collaboration tools that I've just talked about and the technology which is used behind the scenes, whether that is Azure, whether you're using infrastructure in Azure or AWS, or even outside of those. It's the the bridge between those two. And what it is mostly responsible for, as well as that communication, is it'll also be responsible for executing scripts or commands between, which might then send instructions to your infrastructure, which I've kind of covered off with the third point on this slide here about integrating with our systems. It'd be a bit unfair of me to, say, because this talks mostly about the AWS chatbot, it'd be unfair to me to say that, that's the only chatbot out there, which is not the case. And so I thought I'd point out some open source chatbots that are available, which then help teams drive that ChatOps model within your work. So the first one I wanted to just quickly mention was Hubot, written in CoffeeScript and Node. It was actually created by GitHub, went under a massive revamp, and then was open sourced. And it's deployable to Heroku or Azure. So yeah, if that's something that you think your team could adopt, it's definitely worth looking into. Next, we have Lita, which is written in Ruby. One of the benefits with Lita is that you can make use of the Ruby gems and bundler, as well as it coming with the persistent storage provided by Redis. Next, we have which has got to be my favorite named bot. And I also do think the logo captures the name pretty well, like every day you go. But what is good with is because it's Python, it's really extensible to other frameworks. So that's, one of, I'm not saying that because I'm biased towards Python, but I think that's one of the big pluses with So this then brings me on to the AWS chatbot itself. So AWS chatbot was announced at the reInvent in 2019. So it's quite a new tool in regards to the other services AWS provide. But its definition that it gives is that it is DevOps teams and can start integrating the ChatOps model within their workplace, and it helps you to monitor and interact with your AWS resources through the collaboration tools that I mentioned earlier. So that's all great, but I will say, because it's quite new, it only integrates with Slack or Amazon Chime. So for those who might not be using those collaboration tools, might not be able to make use of AWS chatbot just yet. However, I think if they got a lot of interest, that is something they would definitely look into doing. So that's great. How does it work? So I've actually stole this from the AWS documentation, but I thought it did describe how it works at a high level pretty well. So we start with a publisher, and this usually will be some kind of AWS service which will publish a notification. Those notifications could include CloudWatch alarms or events. It could be budget alerts, have you gone over your budget for this month? Maybe even CloudFormation stacks you're deploying. You might get an update on the status that it's currently at. These are all different, that's not an exhaustive list. There are loads of others, but some kind of event is going to happen in your AWS. And what you can do is you will then hook it up with this Amazon SNS. Amazon SNS is a simple notification service. It's kind of a pub/sub model, and it has multiple subscription options. So you could hook up an email. So if your DevOps team has a group email, it could be hooked up with that. It also does SMS if you really want to put your mobile phone to receive these notifications. And it also has HTTPS endpoints available, which is what AWS Chatbot uses. So you have these notifications set up, and AWS Chatbot has access to the endpoint, and that's how it receives these notifications. So AWS Chatbot then takes those notifications and reformats them, makes them look more pretty to the eye, and then will post to Slack or Amazon Chime for teams to be notified on. And then from the collaboration tools such as Slack, you could then interact back to the chatbot with maybe actions from the notification. So maybe, you know, there's something that needs to be actioned on. You've received a budget alert. You might want to raise a support case ticket to argue why your bill is too much this month compared to previous ones or such. But you know, you don't always have to interact back with the chatbot. It's just a good way to say, you know, if you have gone over your budget, maybe that gives the team some incentive to go and explore why that is the case. So yeah, that's this. It is worth noting that only Slack supports at the minute talking back to the chatbot and executing those commands from Slack. So even Amazon Chimes doesn't have that capability yet. So I think this comes back to the point that it's still quite young in its development. However, one of the other positives, sort of, is that it is free, a free service. However, saying that, I've put a little asterisk there because I don't want you to go away and think, oh yeah, she said it was free. The resources that are used underneath the chatbot, so those SNS topics or other resources that you might be using under the hood, they're still chargeable, but the chatbot integration itself is free. And that kind of brings me on to my demo, which when I tested this morning was brilliant. So I'm going to come out of my screen. So first I'll set the story. I've got a website and it's running. And just to show you that, I'm going to go to my website. I take it you can still see my screen, hopefully.
Yep, still got it.
And this is where, it was working earlier. Oh, I know why. So for those of you that can see my screen, I was connected to the VPN, which I had configured, and I'm no longer able to. I have a feeling I'll drop off if I connect to it.
Yeah, no worries. It's the demons of a demo god, isn't it? If you need to do that, that's fine. We can hang on.
Just leave you all in suspense at this amazing demo that you're about to witness.
It's just showmanship, right?
I mean, there's no fun if it goes smoothly. Quiet, but am I still on the call?
Yeah, we've still got you. There was a brief glitch, but you're all good.
Ah, nice, smooth. Hello, DevOps. So this is the critical website that has to be up at all times. I cannot afford my business, who I work for. Yeah, I know I'm unstable. Has got to stay up, and that is one of the goals of our team. We've got to monitor and make sure that this website is always up and running. So just for a bit of background, behind the scenes, this is an EC2 server that is hosting my website, and I have some alarms that I've configured. So such as instance change, the health might suddenly become, it's randomly terminated, or it's starting a reboot or anything along those lines. I actually do also have a load balancer. So maybe, if there was a spike in traffic to this amazing website, then that would also be captured. So what I'm going to do for the purpose of this demo is I'm actually going to manually stop this server. Yes, I do want to stop it. And hopefully, whilst that is stopping, I'm going to not be able to see the website anymore. So it's suddenly become unavailable. Now, I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to force the alarm to go into a state which says, oh no, this is bad. And I don't think you saw it on my screen, but I did get a notification into Slack. And so obviously this would be where my team, where we're all working, and we've all at the same time received this notification that the website, there's something wrong. It's not been able to do a status check, all hands on deck. But because it's in Slack, we can easily talk to each other. So I might say, I'm going to pick up this issue because I'm free. Other members in my team might be in meetings, or they might, be unavailable. But just for clarity, it's all in one place, and we can see that the problem will have been mitigated. So because I have the AWS chatbot, you can actually then do commands. So I'm going to do AWS. This is kind of like the AWS CLI, but within Slack. So I'm going to do AWS Lambda, and I'm just going to list my functions just so you can see that it's working. I'll invite them first, that would be great. And I've also, so I did this on a different channel, which is why which is why this is now throwing a hissy fit. So that's really, US, not US. That's more like it. So this is just giving a list of all available Lambda functions which I have access to. Obviously, I've only got one in my account. So, I mean, if you did this where you might have hundreds of Lambda functions, probably wouldn't recommend doing it in Slack. I'm sure everyone on your team would love you. However, the site is down, so more pressing things are on my mind. So I'm going to invoke a Lambda function. I will say one of the caveats with AWS Chatbot is I am required to, like, for this demo, I know what my function name is called. I know what my payload needs to be. So it's pretty, for that side of things for this demo, it's pretty okay. But when it comes on to, you have hundreds of Lambda functions and you have hundreds of different, or, other services that might be integrated, then it becomes an issue because you need to start them remembering all these payloads and everything, which is not ideal. So I will say that is one of the caveats. However, for the sake of this demo, I've got this function name and the payload. I know because from my alarm, it kindly gave me the ID. I'm just going to copy that for now. But it throws a hissy fit because that's in capitals. Just Cap's angry today. I actually don't know if it is case sensitive. That's probably something we could look into. Right, I'm hoping this will work. So it's just clarifying whether I want to actually do this action. Do I want to invoke this Lambda function? Do I want to do this? I'm going to click yes. That's interesting. Oh, I did this last time. I don't know why I did this. I think it's some reason chucked in some random stars in here. Oh, I think it's because it was in bold. So another thing that is slightly annoying, I just feel like I'm turning this into a moaning battle, but another thing that is a little annoying, so behind the scenes, this is actually working. However, in Slack, it looks like it hasn't triggered, it hasn't sent anything off. So you're kind of in limbo. You're a bit like, you know, has it done what it's doing? However, the fact that it's still in limbo, I do know it has been sent off behind the scenes. But when you then get a response, so because I know this is a Lambda function, when I get an output from the Lambda function, it will be returned into the Slack for me to see that it has successfully ran. However, it is annoying that in between you're a little unsure. But it's great to see that this has got a status code of 200, so that's great. But just to clarify, let's give this a refresh. Site's back up. So that brings the demo to an end. Just present my. So I will just say that was a very quick demo and only touches the surface on some of the capabilities you can do with Chatbot, but I just thought it'd be quite cool to see how it does work, for you to see how it does work. If you are interested, I have made the code, so the infrastructure I use behind the scenes, I've made it available on my GitHub. At the minute, there's just the VPN infrastructure that I've used. However, I have made a branch and I'm going to be pushing it straight after this talk, so don't worry. But if you are interested, you know, feel free to go and have a look. Like I said, there are other examples that you can do. So I mentioned budgets. Maybe you want your team to be alerted when certain budget thresholds have been exceeded. Maybe you want to hook up AWS Security Hub or Amazon Guard Duty. I've really noticed that my talk's quite heavy on AWS talk, but you know, Guard Duty is one of the services which, you know, if anyone, say for example, is trying to brute force into your servers, Guard Duty would send a notification and you could then have that sent to Slack. So then, you know, if someone's trying to brute force or there's some open ports that shouldn't be, the team can then, you know, action that. Maybe you just want to get some, you know, updates on your CloudFormation stacks. You know, has it been deployed successfully, or has there been a rollback? These are all things that you can have integrated with your collaboration tools. However, as you've noticed during the demo, I kind of said a lot of but. So I just wanted to quickly talk through some of those. So from a security side, one of the benefits is that certain services are not available for talking to, such as IAM and KMS. And I think that's probably a good thing. You don't want people from Slack changing roles and policies or receiving your KMS keys. So that is one good thing. The reason I brought it up as a consideration is that the channel that is hooked up with your Slack channel, which is hooked up with AWS Chatbot, has a role associated with it. You have to be careful who has access to the channel. So anyone who does have access can use the commands that you saw me executing. So you might have someone who's not in DevOps or not in your team come in and they could technically run those commands, which is a bit scary. I guess one way around that is that you'd have to have a private channel, and so only members of your team are in that channel. And but then that might go against some companies like ethos of like, let's be open, let's be collaborative. So I guess that's just one consideration. The second bit is as we probably know, AWS documentation is a bit of a rabbit hole. So some of the issues I experienced when working with Chatbot is I had some events or notifications that I had in mind that I wanted to integrate, but it wouldn't work. And it took a long time to actually find a list of resources which are supported. So even though it does support AWS CloudWatch alarms and events, only certain events are supported, which is kind of a bit counterintuitive. So you do have to be careful on what exactly you want to have. And obviously, as I mentioned at the start, the chat tools that are integrated with Chatbot, it's only Slack and Amazon Chimes to begin with. So yes, that kind of brings me to the end of my talk. So I have no idea how I did on time.
Yeah, it's just about right, to be honest with you. Thanks so much for that. It was a really, really great talk and a good demo too, despite the difficulty around VPN. Seemed to sail through that quite nicely. So I'll hand over to James now to go through the Q&A with you.
Yeah, bro. Yeah, well, a tech demo as well, so that was brilliant. And joining on, like Lee said, joining on a VPN through it as well. It's absolutely great to see that, Lauren. We've had some questions in, so I thought we'd get your thoughts on it. One first one that we've had come in is, if you wanted to get started with ChatOps in your team, which operational area would you recommend starting in? E.g., would it be some kind of alert response or something like two-way CI/CD communication? Where would you start?
I think if I wanted to integrate ChatOps in general as a method into the business, I would probably try and highlight some areas which you think would benefit the most from having some kind of ChatOps model. So, I mean, I would definitely start with, what is most critical to your business that you would want to be monitored at all times, or, what you see as really important. And I guess the teams probably, you'll have different opinions across different teams, but I guess trying to collaborate together and work out what you see fit is probably where I would start. That would probably be my advice.
Yeah. Well, thank you. On the actions, so in the responses that you could do, what are somebody's asked a question around what are the action limitations of the chatbot, i.e., can it only run AWS CLI commands? Are there any limitations there?
I guess limitations, it kind of plays a part with the IAM role, which is attached. So I think the limitations are it doesn't have the full broad of resources like you do in the CLI. So from the CLI, you can access all resources or services, whereas the chatbot it's very limited. So I think you can raise like support case tickets for your account. You can invoke Lambda functions. However, what I do see around that is because you can invoke a Lambda function, you then can technically do anything with your other resources. I mean, so behind the scenes, I wanted to send a command to my server, which I use Systems Manager for. But all my Lambda function was get the document, the SSM document, and then send that to the server. So even though Systems Manager isn't supported by the Slack, I kind of came away around that, sort of, if that makes sense. But yeah, it is still quite young in its development. So there's only like raising support case tickets, Lambda functions, and I think there's another one, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
Right. Cool. Yeah, on that front, we've had one in around security as well. So the major security implications running AWS commands via Slack, which I think you were mentioning there, weren't you? So is MFA on chatbot a possibility to omit Slack being a possible vulnerability? So can we do MFA with that?
Not at the minute, no. Yeah, not at the minute. So that's why I think I think if you were going to look into using it, I'd probably have a private Slack channel just to avoid instances of anyone being able to run some kind of command from Slack. Yeah, that'd probably be my first.
Yeah, and I think we've got one last one, which is an interesting one in terms of the audit trail as well. So how are responses logged and controlled? And then I think it's a bit of a follow-up of that is, can you disable commands and only use it for notifications? So can you have it just as an incoming?
Yeah, so some of the roles that come with AWS Chatbot is read only or notification only. So you can definitely disable being able to execute commands from Slack. So yes, you can just use it as a notification tool. I don't know if I've answered that or not, but I guess it's the security. Was it the security side? Sorry,
Yeah, so how are the responses logged and controlled? Is there a trail behind those?
Yeah, so you can have CloudWatch logs enabled. So any responses and requests between the collaboration tool and your AWS resources will be logged in CloudWatch logs. So then you've got that audit trail of what commands were run. However, that being said, they will all be logged as the IAM role attached to that channel. So if I run a command, but then my colleague Bob runs a command, they come across as the same role. So then it's a bit, you can't identify exactly who in the business ran that. So that is something else to consider as well.
Right, got you. We've had a couple on the Q&A as well. Really good operational one, this one. So do you use runbooks against it? So get an alert and follow X guide. Can you run that kind of thing through chatbot systems, like a runbook?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you would be able to, but I think it's definitely something worth looking into. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer that. I'd probably have to go away and get back to you on that one. I'm not 100% sure, but it does seem like it would be a good use case to be able to do that.
And promise it's the last one. Do you have the capability to capture data around the bot messages? So in X month, there were X amount of messages and there were X issues or CPU issues. Can you capture that kind of data, observability data through the chatbot systems?
I guess you could, but you'd have to probably do that manually yourself within AWS. So I imagine you'd have to have something in place which says how many from my CloudWatch logs, how many of those contained, this command, or how many, like in terms of how many messages were received, like the notifications themselves. I don't know how it would be handled, but I guess from a logs perspective, you could probably use the CloudWatch logs to then get some of that data or information. However, I think that's outside of the capability of AWS Chatbot. I think that's something you'd have to go away and do.
Right, brilliant. Love that. Thank you. Right, I'll pass back to yourself. Thank you again, Lauren.
That's all right.
Yeah, cheers for that. Some really good questions there, I think. Okay, so yeah, much appreciated, Lauren. We shall move on over to Sophie, who looks like she's ready and waiting with designing teams. So yeah, as usual, just drop your questions into either the Q&A session or the chat, and I shall mute myself and Sophie, if you're good to go.
Yeah, right, let me just do the thing with PowerPoint. Was that?
See that? Yeah, got it.
Yeah, all right, cool. So hi everyone. So this talk is about technology teams, very different from Lauren's talk. It's about what makes a good technology team, and it's inspired in part by the book Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Peixe that was published back in September last year. Reading this really got me thinking about the whole idea of technology teams and about some of the things that go into making a great technology team. Factors such as a team's shape and size, how the people in a team work together and communicate, and also how teams communicate with each other. So how teams work is hugely important, both for the organisation that these teams are a part of, because an organisation needs its teams to be effective and efficient, delivering value. And it's also hugely important for the people in those teams, because this is their job, this is their daily experience of life at work. So I know from my own experience that often teams are expected to just happen somehow magically, from pulling a group of individuals together and just declaring them to be a team without a great deal of thought being given to how that team will really come together and how it will operate. But there are lots of things that we can consciously and deliberately do, and steps we can take to improve the way our teams are formed and the way they work. So very little about me. I've worked in tech for about 25 years now, mostly as a software engineer. And for much of that time, I was working with ops teams and writing tools for ops teams. So I'm kind of a bit obsessed about DevOps. I currently work at Anaplan in York. I'm a senior engineer and DevOps advocate. Outside of work, I'm an ambassador for Women in Tech York. We're also currently holding our events online. You can find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. And I'm also one of the organisers for DevOps Days London, which sadly was cancelled this year for the obvious reason. Hopefully next year we'll be able to go ahead with the conference. So this talk is split into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to consider some of the factors that contribute to making a successful and effective team. And in the second part, I want to introduce some of the ideas from team topologies, which takes the concept of designing teams a step further and actually introduces some patterns for different types of technology teams and for different forms of interaction between teams. So if there's kind of one key idea I'd like you to take away from this talk, it's that great teams don't happen by accident. So the first thing I want to talk about is team structure. For a long time in software development, we had teams that were structured simply along functional lines. So you'd find a team of developers, a team of testers, a team of ops engineers. But these teams were extremely siloed. There was often very little communication between them. There was a lack of common purpose, and work would just be thrown over the wall from one team to another. I've worked in this kind of environment. One team I worked in was so siloed that even Microsoft and Java developers barely spoke to each other. Often these teams would be given different priorities that were at odds with each other. So developers were tasked with making changes and creating new features, and operations were tasked with keeping systems working and stable, keeping the lights on, making sure there was no downtime. So as I'm sure you all know, this is like the origin of the DevOps movement, from some people becoming convinced that having this separation and these opposing priorities was extremely detrimental, and that it was only by bringing Dev and Ops together and getting us working together with a common purpose that we'd be able to improve the work we do. But the structure of our technology teams has an even greater impact on the work we do than just that wall of confusion that used to exist between Dev and Ops. Because the structure of our teams actually impacts the structure of the software that we're able to create. This is because of something known as Conway's Law. So in 1968, Melvin Conway published a paper titled "How Do Committees Invent?", in which he stated that organizations that design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. What that means is that the architecture of the software we write will end up mirroring the architecture of the teams that write it. So the kind of classic take on this is that if we have 4 teams writing a compiler, we'll end up with a 4-pass compiler. Put another way, if you have a team of front-end devs and 2 teams of back-end devs, each working on a separate component, plus a team of DBAs, something like this, then the architecture of the application created by those teams will probably end up looking something like this. Obviously, this isn't an absolute given. It is possible to overcome the team architecture and produce software architecture that looks different. But you'll be fighting what Alan Kelly, who's an Agile consultant, he's written several books on Agile ways of working, and he's given talks kind of entirely on this topic. It's what he calls the homomorphic force. So the pull of the people is the strongest thing, and it's the thing that will win. So this has led to what's known as the reverse Conway maneuver, which is the idea of starting with the architecture of the software that we want to produce, and then creating teams whose structure will kind of naturally produce software with that architecture, but more on that later. So moving away from structure to consider size, how big should a good technology team be? Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon, famously said that no team should be bigger than can be fed by 2 pizzas. But why? What's better about small teams? With a smaller team, it's easier to stay focused and make decisions. There's less overhead on communication and keeping everyone updated, less time spent in meetings. It's not so much about the number of people, but about the number of links between those people and the coordination cost involved in managing those links. There's actually a simple formula to calculate the number of links. Multiply the number of people in the team by the number of people minus 1, and then divide that by 2. So if there's 6 people in your team, that's 15 links. If you double the number of people to 12, the number of links shoots up to 66. That's a lot of links and consequently a lot of overhead in managing those relationships. So this is one of the main reasons why small teams are better, because it enables us to form and maintain good and meaningful relationships with those in our team. Even when the structure and the size of a team is consciously designed, teams don't just happen effortlessly. The people in that team don't immediately come together and start working effectively together as a team. It takes time for that to happen, for those relationships to form and for ways of working to be agreed upon. In 1965, American psychologist Bruce Tuckman published his team development model, which describes 4 stages of how individuals come together and start performing as a team. These stages are forming, storming, norming, and performing. So forming is when a team first comes together. Team members tend to behave independently, and although goodwill may exist, they don't know each other well enough to trust each other unconditionally. Storming is the phase where relationships between team members will be made or broken, where you start to work through those differences. Norming tends to be a move towards more harmonious working practices, with teams agreeing on the rules and the values by which they operate. And finally, performing. So not all teams make it to this stage. Performing teams are identified by high levels of independence, motivation, knowledge, and competence. It's also important to understand that teams are immutable structures. So when you make a change to the team, when someone leaves or you introduce someone new, it's effectively a new team. And that new team will also have to go through those stages of forming, storming, norming, and performing. It may not take quite as long as when an entirely new team comes together for the first time, but the change team is not going to continue to deliver value as effectively as the old team did until it's had time to go through this process again. One final point about the makeup of teams is about diversity. So not only is striving to have more diverse teams the moral thing to do, but it's also the sensible thing to do. Research has shown that companies with more culturally and ethnically diverse teams are more profitable. And research has also shown that the collective intelligence of a team is not directly correlated with the individual intelligence of those in the team. A paper by Anita Woolley and others in 2010 showed that factors that do contribute to collective intelligence are empathy, psychological safety, I'll come back to that in a bit, and gender diversity. So recruiting for diversity is something that's very much within our ability to influence, if not control, through our hiring and interview processes. So I'm going to move on now to look at some of the internal attributes of a team that are important. These aren't so much things that can be kind of designed into a team, but more things that we should strive for and nurture. So team culture is obviously incredibly important, and there are things that we can do to deliberately mold a team's culture. The team should discuss and decide for itself what its rules and values are. What are the things that matter most to the team, so that everybody in the team is in agreement. And these rules and values should be visualized in some way so that it's quite explicit and clear to everybody, both inside the team and outside, how this team works. So one way to do this is by having a team charter, which lists the rules and practices that the team's decided they want to abide by. These are written down and each member of the team then signs the charter so that everybody is quite literally signed up to this being the way the team's going to work. Kanban boards are another great way for a team to both model and radiate information about their ways of working. Things like setting work in progress or WIP limits that ensure pairing, or deciding to have and display a rule that a card can only be moved into the done column when all the documentation relating to that piece of work has been reviewed. And finally, what rituals and ceremonies does the team want to have? A daily stand-up to discuss work in progress and blockers, a monthly retrospective to reflect on and improve how the team's working. In happier times, do we all go to the pub together on a Friday lunchtime? All of these things contribute to the culture of a team. So I said we'd come back to psychological safety. If you remember, this is one of the factors that contributes to the collective intelligence of a team. The name psychological safety was coined by Amy Edmondson from Harvard, and it's about feeling safe within your team, feeling safe to speak your mind, say when you think something is risky or not working, feeling safe to voice your ideas, suggest new and different ways of approaching a problem, and really importantly, feeling safe to experiment and fail and make mistakes, because that's when we learn. So Google ran a research project called Project Aristotle, in which they set out to determine what are the most common attributes of the most effective and high-performing teams at Google. And they discovered that the single most important factor is psychological safety, about everybody's voice being heard. So a quick word on coaching. In the world of sport, we totally accept the idea and the role of the team coach. It's absolutely the norm. Show me any sports team, from the local school football team to the World Cup winning men and women's England cricket teams, that don't have a coach, whose role it is to improve the performance of the team, regardless of the particular talents or abilities of the individuals in that team. But in the world of technology, we expect our teams to be effective and high performing simply as a matter of course. To be fair, the idea of coaching and the role of the agile coach has gained traction in the development side of software delivery, but in my experience, it has yet to make much headway anywhere beyond kind of purely dev teams. In my last job, I spent some time working with teams of operations engineers, introducing them to the ideas of Kanban and of team retrospectives. And for most of them, this was an entirely new concept, that you would spend time getting together as a team to simply reflect on how well you work together as a team and to think about ways that you can improve. So coaching is something that we can and should be doing much more of in our technology teams to help them succeed and deliver value. So not dissimilar to psychological safety is the idea of team health or team happiness. I know this sounds remarkably kind of right on and fluffy, but simply asking how the people in your team are doing, how they're feeling, can make such a difference. Tom Hoyland, an agile coach at Sky Betting and Gaming, gave a brilliant talk at DevOps Days London in September last year about building and growing an agile team. I think he may have given that talk at Manchester DevOps too, about his experiences with the login and registration squad at Sky. So he talked about the many different metrics that his team gathered as they embarked upon a journey of improvement, things like cycle time, so how fast is the team going, number of defects and the number of incidents. But amongst all these more typical metrics, they also decided to monitor and graph team health and happiness. They started asking everybody in their team 6 questions each week. Do you feel focused? Do you have a strong business awareness? Do you feel that we're building the right thing in the right way? Are the things that are moving through our pipeline of the right size? Do you have time to collaborate with and listen to your colleagues? And do you feel that your voice is heard? Tom said that it was these metrics, this happiness index, more than anything else, which was the leading indicator of how productive the team was going to be over the next week and the next month. And Tom meant leading indicator both in the sense that it's one of the best, but also in the sense that it's predictive, which is really important. Most of these metrics we gather about how our teams are doing, things like lead time, mean time to recovery, change fail percentage. These are all what are known as lagging indicators. So they tell us how we did, not how we're going to do. This makes this metric incredibly useful. In a way, this is the same as the issue of diversity. Not only is caring about the happiness of the people in your team the morally right thing to do, but it also makes business sense. So stepping outside the team itself now, I want to look at the wider context in which a team works. The first question I want to ask is, how does a team communicate with other teams and with the wider organization? What does its API look like? So I'm assuming that everybody here knows what an API is. It's that layer of a software component that a user actually interacts with. It's a contract. It tells you both what a component does and how you use it. What it doesn't tell you is any implementation details, because as a user, you don't need to know. So for the component itself, its API is a protective shell that shields its internal workings from the rest of the system and allows it to expose only the functionality that it needs to in the way that it wants to. It stops calls to low-level functions deep in the code. It stops direct access to its database. When that happens, the two components are tightly coupled, and it means that the teams responsible for those components are also tightly coupled. In this example, if Team A didn't use the lovely API provided by Team B and instead went straight into Team B's database, Team B would no longer be able to make changes to how their data is managed without first either consulting with Team A or risk breaking Team A's code. By having an API, Team B protects its code from tight coupling, which in turn protects the team from tight coupling. It protects their autonomy and their ability to make decisions and work independently. Jeff Bezos from Amazon, again, famously sent out a memo to all Amazon employees in 2002, which said that from that point on, all teams had to expose their data and services only through interfaces, that no other form of inter-process communication would be allowed, and also that all interfaces had to be good enough to be exposed to the wider world in general, not just internally within Amazon. The memo also said that anybody not complying with this would be fired. That's how important he considered this to be. But teams also have an API in a wider sense, and that API is about how the team itself works and how others in the organization interact with it. In addition to its software API, what makes up a team API is the team's ways of working, the documentation that a team has about its services, information on what the team's currently working on, what it'll be working on next, what its priorities are, what the team's preferred communication methods are. Should you ping this team a message in Slack or send them an email or even just raise a ticket in their queue? In the same way as the software API is a boundary for an application, the team API should be the boundary for the team. Work should come to the team, not to individuals in the team. A training budget should be given to the team. Nobody using the services of that team should care about its internal workings, whether it uses Scrum or Kanban, for example. And the team should be able to change how it does things, work on new services. And until the team chooses to expose those via its API, nobody else need know or care. Another external factor to consider is the physical space that a team works in and the impact that has on the work that the team does. Somehow in technology, we've arrived at a default of open plan offices, and I'm very much not convinced that that open plan is the best environment for the kind of collaborative knowledge work that we do. Open plan offices can be very noisy and distracting places. Teams need space where they can collaborate and have impromptu meetings to discuss their work. Ideally, they need wall space so that they can use for everything from whiteboarding designs to sticking up their team charter or visualizing metrics. One of my favorite case studies in team topologies is about AutoTrader, which has totally transformed itself in recent years from being a traditional print company to an entirely digital enterprise, and the approach they took to the redesign of their office space in 2013. They made huge efforts to make their team spaces great spaces to work in, with writable walls, informal spaces for those impromptu meetings, a clear desk policy with lockers for belongings to encourage people to sit in the best place depending on who they needed to work with on any given day. And recognizing Conway's law, they actually separated some teams by putting them on different floors in the building to deliberately restrict their opportunities for communication. So of course, 2020 has different ideas, and for many of us, the rules have suddenly changed, and we found ourselves working from home and all that entails. Some people are fortunate and have a spare room with space for a desk and a proper chair. Others are lucky if they can find a quiet corner somewhere with just enough space to balance a laptop. Many of us are juggling family and work life in a way that we probably wouldn't have thought feasible at the start of the year. I'm not going to talk much now about remote working and remote teams. I think that could probably be a whole talk in itself. I think it's clear that the way we work in tech has probably changed forever. Twitter is just one of the big names that's already announced that employees can continue to work remotely permanently. and no doubt others will follow. I do think that most places will continue to have offices though, and all those considerations about how office space is set up for teams and individuals, having the right kind of space for the right kind of work, and to encourage the right kind of interactions will still apply. So that brings me on to the second part of my talk, where I want to go briefly through some of the ideas presented in team topologies. As I said, this book is by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Peixe, and it was published by IT Revolution back in September 2019. So this book talks a lot about Conway's law. In some ways, it takes Conway's law and the reverse Conway maneuver to its logical conclusion by actually suggesting patterns for team structures. And it introduces 4 fundamental types of team that they argue all technology teams should be comprised. These are stream-aligned teams, platform teams, complicated subsystem teams, and enabling teams. So stream-aligned teams are aligned to a single valuable stream of work and aim to produce a steady flow of feature delivery. They're the primary team type in an organization. Stream-aligned teams are empowered to build and deliver customer value as safely, quickly, and independently as possible. And they have minimal, ideally 0 handoffs of work to other teams. The purpose of platform teams is to enable stream-aligned teams to work with autonomy. A platform team has a strong focus on the usability and reliability of their services and leads by example, so using the services they provide internally where applicable, and consuming lower level platforms owned by other platform teams whenever possible. Complicated subsystem teams are responsible for building and maintaining a part of the system that depends heavily on specialist knowledge. So the goal of this team is to reduce the cognitive load of streamlined teams and offload work from those teams. Cognitive load is something we'll come back to in a minute. An organization should expect to have only a few complicated subsystem teams. And finally, enabling teams. Enabling teams are composed of specialists in a given technical or product domain. So their purpose is to research and provide guidance on tooling, practices, frameworks, and the technology stack being used. And their goal is to increase the autonomy of stream-aligned teams. An enabling team proactively seeks to understand the needs of stream-aligned teams and stays ahead of the curve in keeping abreast of new approaches, tooling, and practices in their area of expertise. So I said we'd come back to cognitive load. The cognitive load of a team is another important idea that's presented in the book. The authors argue that a team should not be asked to take on too much complexity, because when that happens, both the team and the work will start to suffer as a consequence. They suggest a number of different approaches to limit the cognitive load for any one team by looking at the complexity of the domain in which the team works. So how complex is the problem that we're trying to solve? So rather than either having one giant monolith or many small microservices, we should instead aim to design and evolve software system boundaries to match team cognitive load. So one of the benefits of this approach is that the team develops a good mental model of the software being worked on, which leads to more coherent code, fewer mistakes, and more rapid delivery of outcomes. So along with those 4 team types, the book also describes 3 different types of interaction that those teams should effectively be restricted to. It sounds a little extreme in some ways, but the argument is that by deliberately and consciously restricting the way that teams interact, and by forcing them to interact and communicate in particular ways, we make Conway's law work for us and not against us. So these types of interaction are facilitating, collaboration, and X as a service. So facilitating is about helping teams to increase flow and clear impediments. It's about reducing gaps in capabilities. The downside is that it requires experienced staff to not work on building or running things. Collaboration is about driving innovation and rapid discovery with fewer handoffs. The downside of this approach is that more detail and context is needed between teams. So this can lead to higher cognitive load and possibly reduced output during collaboration than previously. And X as a service is about predictable delivery with clear responsibility boundaries. The less context and collaboration is needed between teams, so cognitive load is limited. The downside is the danger of reduced flow if the API or boundary is not effective, and possibly slower innovation at the API or boundary. So putting it all together, as already mentioned, streamlined teams should be the primary team type in an organization. These should be supported by complicated subsystem teams where needed, and by platform teams, which should in turn be supported by lower level platform teams. They should all then be assisted by enabling teams. There are some examples given in the book of different configurations of teams according to different circumstances, and the book has plenty of very helpful diagrams to illustrate this. The different interaction types require different types of behavior from teams, and it may be that training is needed. For example, collaboration mode requires a high degree of interaction and mutual respect between the two collaborating teams, and teams should expect activities to take much longer. Some training or coaching in such skills as pair or mob programming and whiteboard sketching would probably help. The team structures and the way the teams collaborate should evolve over time. This might be a deliberate plan. For example, a streamlined team might collaborate for a short period of time with a platform team, whilst together they investigate the requirements for a new service to be provided as part of the platform. Once those requirements and how they will be met are understood, the interaction type between the two teams can revert to X as a service. Sometimes a change will need to happen simply because situations change over time. Examples of triggers or signs that it's time for a change are when the software has grown too large for one team to manage, or when delivery cadence is becoming slower. So that's all I'm going to say about team topologies. Obviously, I've barely skimmed the surface of the content and ideas presented in the book, but I just wanted to give you an impression of what the book is about and hopefully inspire some of you to go away and read it for yourselves. And that kind of brings me to the end of my talk. To summarize very briefly, successful teams need to be designed and nurtured. They don't just happen by accident. Many factors contribute to a team's success: shape, size, culture, APIs, the physical space that the team works in. However, Google found that the single most important factor in a team is psychological safety. And team topologies suggest patterns for how teams should be structured and how and when teams should interact with each other. And it also talks at length about cognitive load of teams and other interesting stuff, such as the fracture planes of software system boundaries and different types of coupling between systems. And it also has lots of interesting case studies from various industries. It really is a very good read. Thank you. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sophie. That was fantastic. Really, really great. Lots of content there. And as you can imagine, we've had lots of questions in. People looking to pick your brains on a few things. So I'll go to the Q&A one that we've had first. Do you have any advice for having conversations with senior leadership about investing in things like agile coaching for ops teams?
No, it's a really hard one. I just kind of did it, which is often the answer you'll hear of things like this. It's almost just like, you just tell me why I can't do this. But I guess you've got to have someone who's prepared or able to do the coaching. I just kind of got a bit bolshy eventually.
Just went in there and
started interfering.
So a forgiveness, not permission approach.
Very much, yeah.
Yeah, got you. Brilliant. We've had a few questions around that kind of forming, storming, norming, performing phases. How do you measure or identify where a team is at? Have you got any tips on that through that cycle of forming, storming?
That's a good question. No, because I think it's fairly fluid. And I think it's just more about feeling, I guess, than it's not like there's a definite stage. You can say we're going to spend a week forming and a week storm. You know, it's. I think you just have to do those good things that teams do, which is listen to each other and have the retrospectives and iterate and be reflective.
Yeah, but it's a lot more subjective, would you say, that in this situation, or is there?
Yeah, and it's one of those things we always call these soft skills, but they're actually the hard ones, aren't they?
Yeah. It really underplays it, doesn't it? That soft skill. Some great questions in around kind of diversity in engineering teams as well. Why do you think yourself there's such a lack of diversity in engineering teams?
I think it's a really big problem. It goes way back to how we bring up our kids to start with. We drill it into them from a young age that, you know, pink is for girls and blue is for boys, and boys are good at maths and girls aren't interested in maths and science, and it goes from there. And the whole thing about kind of programming, it's what they call the programmers. That's it. I can't get the words out. I think we just have a bad kind of culture, and then that then goes into recruitment because all the cognitive biases start to kick in. So people recruit people who look like themselves, and it's just a real problem. And I think also around it's a lot better than it was when I started. I was very fortunate to get a part-time job because I got not my first job, but I applied for a job after I'd had a baby, and it was impossible to find flexible work and part-time hours, and that's an awful lot better now than it was. So that kind of stuff, because women leave jobs and it's hard to come back. So there's lots and lots of reasons. It's a wide problem. There's no one simple answer to that. Yeah,
that leaky bucket, so to speak, isn't it, of people leaving jobs and then to return. People looking at things they can do. A question coming is what are some of the, I suppose, immediate and long-term actions people can do individually to promote a diverse team?
In terms of recruitment, one of the things we found is just having more women involved in interviews, and not just interviewing with female candidates, but just generally doing interviews, because you just get a different perspective. And you start to maybe get people who are more not interested in diversity, but it just kind of widens the questions you get and widens the views you get. And just trying to make tech a good place for everybody to be. I mean, it's not just about gender diversity, it's about ethnic diversity as well, isn't it? We all benefit from having a wider pool of views to draw on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna use the time to ask a question from myself, actually. So you know the sports analogy you used at the early parts of your slides around like agile coaches, and there's always a coach for a sports team. One of the things I've always wondered is in the sports analogy, a lot of time is dedicated to practice, and actually a very small portion of time is match day. In tech work, especially in ops, it could feel somewhat like every day's match day. Have you seen any practices in teams you've worked with or teams you've created where you've had a good implementation of team practice?
Well, I guess there's the whole idea of drills. I mean, that is thinking tech-wise, just because the practicing for when things go wrong rather than waiting for when things go wrong and you don't know. But I also think this is where the whole thing of DevOps and pipelines and small changes and doing things more frequently is we're almost kind of constantly practicing in terms of that. So I mean, I used to work on where we did giant releases once every 6 months, and they were always hideous. It would take us a week to actually get stuff working. That's because you do it so infrequently that you don't actually know what you're doing. So I think that's part of DevOps, is that small frequent changes. But in terms of teams, again, I think it's just taking the time to be reflective, looking at how you work, not being afraid to try things and change things, do small iterations.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And definitely have a look at the chat. We've got some really great feedback coming through. So thank you again, both Sophie and Lauren, and I'll pass over to Lee.
Yeah, cheers for that. That was a really great talk, super slick. Definitely learned a whole heap from that. So
Cool.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of really good questions as well. Just for the questions in the chat, I've posted the YouTube link to where this will end up, but also we'll probably send an email out with that as well to the DevOps Manchester list. So yeah, thanks to you both, super appreciated. Just I guess from the team at DevOps, a request for speakers first and foremost. So, you know, if you're a first timer, if you're seasoned, if it's a business talk, a culture talk, as you've seen, or a tech talk here, you know, let us know. We'll be super happy to have you along. And in terms of feedback, you know, we're on Twitter. You can drop us a message through Meetup, or if you want to reach out on LinkedIn to any of the organisers on Meetup, you're more than welcome to as well. And we, you know, we try to iterate and change this based on feedback. And I know it's kind of rough remotely, but you know, we're certainly doing our best. So unless there's no additional questions, just lots of praise, which is nice to see. We shall end it there. And yeah, big thanks to everybody, and hopefully we'll see you next time at DevOps Manchester 23. So yeah, thanks everyone.
So bye.